Every day, 34,000 people leave their homes to escape conflict, persecution. Currently, there's 21 million refugees worldwide. More than half of them are youth, minors. What is to be done?
Well, it's a great question, and I would add to that, you have so many million refugees, but you also have people who are designated internally displaced persons, as you probably know. These are people who haven't been forced out of their countries. They've been forced out of their homes, but they're still in their countries. The acronym is IDPs. I think when you include IDPs, the number of people is over 60 million, well over 60 million. So it's a huge crisis. What do we need to do? War is a major cause for massive refugee flows. Another cause for major refugee flows is the abuse of dictators of civilian populations, which can be a part of war too. In the Middle East right now, we see all of the above. We see a brutal dictator, one of the world's worst, most brutal dictators, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, who is carrying out mass atrocities against Syrian civilians.
You mentioned Syria. I want to zero in on Syria because about a quarter of the refugee population comes from Syria. Now, there's some interesting data about refugee mindsets here in the United States. 71% of Americans say they're generally open to the idea of having refugees come here. And even 15% say, hey, just come and stay in my home. But when it comes to Syrian refugees, the mindset's completely different. The majority of Americans say, stay away. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's because our leaders, many of our leaders, have vilified Syrian refugees in a way that I think is really unnecessary, unproductive, and just misguided all around. I think, ISIS said that it would put its terrorists in the refugee flows, and that they would come, if the United States took refugees from Syria, that there would be their personnel in that mix as well. The reality is, though, of course ISIS is going to do that because they want us not to help the refugees, because that reinforces this Muslim versus Christian, United States versus the Middle East narrative that they want to further because it helps their cause. It doesn't help global peace. It doesn't serve our interests. It serves their interests. So that's what they've been promoting, and some of our leaders have foolishly bought into that.
So are you saying that's a vain threat then, that ISIS is going to sneak in terrorists with the flow of refugees from Syria?
Well, they've done it into Europe, but in Europe it's a little different because it's easier to get to Europe from the Middle East than it is to get to the United States from the Middle East. If you're a refugee or a terrorist from the Middle East and you want to get to Europe, you can walk across land, you can take a boat or two. There are a lot of challenges in this process, but it's still easier than getting to the United States. If you want to get to the United States as a refugee, if you really are a refugee, or if you're a terrorist pretending to be a refugee, then you've got to go through a vetting process that takes 1.5 to 2 years. We start with people who are already less likely to threaten us in the first place. So we're talking about...
Do you believe that the current vetting process is robust enough at this stage, or should that be...
I do. I think it's very robust. I think it's very robust. Sure, it could be made better. I mean, we can always improve, and I think we should always try to improve, make improvements. But the important point is when we select people to come to the United States through the refugee process, we first choose people who already aren't likely to threaten us. So we're talking about children, or maybe a single mother with 5 children, and she just cares about providing for her children, highly unlikely to be a terrorist, or an elderly couple, or people who have suffered immensely. Maybe they've been tortured by, for example, the Assad regime or by ISIS. These are people who are clearly aligned with us, not with our enemies, and not with the people who would want to send terrorists here. So we start. This is a very important point. We start by choosing people who are less likely to threaten us, and then we put them through 1.5 to 2 years of vetting. And if you're, let's say, Adam, that you were a terrorist leader and you wanted to get one of your terrorist operatives into the United States, probably the worst way to go about it would be to have them come as a refugee, because you're going to subject them to all kinds of scrutiny that they wouldn't get if they just flew to Mexico and walked across the border, or you could find one of your terrorist operatives in Europe with a European passport and they could just fly in without a visa. So there are many better ways to do it. The worst way would be to go through the refugee process.
So the White House recently announced that next year we're going to accept 110,000 refugees, but only 10,000 of them are going to be from Syria. Is this enough? Can we do more?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we could do more. Certainly, I mean, there are a lot of refugee crises. Obviously, the worst are in the Middle East right now, especially with Syria. I think that the most important thing, though, and this is something that the Obama administration has not focused enough on, is solving the core problem that creates the refugees. These terrorist organizations, they look for dictatorships because they know that under especially brutal dictatorships, these terrorist organizations can come into the populations and generate support from the populations as an alternative to the brutal dictator. And they can also foment divisions between people in those environments where governance is weak. So bottom line is dictators end up creating terrorists either in the short term or the long term. That's what Bashar al-Assad has done, both by torturing the Syrian people and by, in general, depriving them of their universal liberties. ISIS has come in to then make the problem worse. So you asked what the solution is. The solution is to defeat ISIS. The solution is also to constrain Assad and to deprive him of his sources of power so that we can negotiate his departure from Syria and then get the region back on track and allow Syrians to move back to Syria and to rebuild Syria, which is what they want.
So you mentioned some things about Syria specifically, and to me it seems a little bit reminiscent almost of, maybe not quite to the magnitude of, but approaching the magnitude of the Holocaust and what happened to the Jews in Germany. And before that time period, there were some polls done, and the American people, by and large, the supermajority, 67% of them said, we don't want to take these people in. Mm-hmm. And they kind of gave a cold shoulder to these people that were just trying to escape the Holocaust conditions. What can be done to change the American mindset today so that we don't give the cold shoulder to these Syrians just because they're from Syria, if that even should be the case?
Well, I think it begins with leadership. I mean, your points are so valid and so important. And in retrospect, we look back on our actions during World War II and during the Holocaust with a bit of shame. And there was a boat, I forget the name of it, but a boat with a lot of Jewish refugees from Europe that came to the United States and seeking refuge, and we turned it away. And that's a dark episode in our American history. Luckily, finally, we did the right thing, and we stood up for what was right, and many of our soldiers sacrificed their lives in Europe to free Europe and also to stop the Holocaust. But I think our leaders need to remind us of some of our core ideals as Americans, and remind us of the fact that we are a nation of immigrants, and part of that is refugees. I mean, my family first came to the United States in the 1600s, before it was the United States. They came to Massachusetts, and they were seeking economic opportunity, but they were also fleeing the lack of liberty that they were experiencing in Ireland. And so, and then about 200 years later, they joined the church and ultimately made the trek across.
When you say church, you mean the LDS?
The LDS Church, exactly, the Mormon Church. And they then also, seeking religious liberty, made the long and arduous trek across the country here to Utah. But that's not where it ends for me. My mother's family, they escaped Europe and the Holocaust. Some of them they were of the Jewish faith, of the Jewish background, and they escaped the Nazis in Europe and came to the United States and settled in Philadelphia. And all of that is just these are classic American stories, but many Americans can tell stories like these about their ancestors, and others, frankly, we acknowledge were brought here in captivity, and their fight for freedom lasted, longer and occurred here in the United States. So we haven't always been exactly perfect. But we are a country of refugees and of immigrants, and it has made us strong. And why has it made us strong? It's made us strong because we've been a place where people from around the world believe they can come and find liberty. That means people with the best ideas in science and technology feel that they can.
Einstein was a refugee.
Einstein, exactly, can come to the United States and build their dreams, and then as a result build us and make us stronger and give us a better opportunity to be a force for good in the world.